Protestants sometimes imagine purgatory as a dreary prison where believers have to pay for sins before they can get into heaven. And they say that Catholics ignore this allegedly traditional teaching on the matter to make purgatory more palatable to potential converts. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about what the church does and does not teach about the nature of purgatory and why this is a doctrine every Christian should embrace.
DMing me, pinging me in my Discord, things like that, asking me about the new Trent Horn video. And I thought that I should make a few comments. Now, these comments aren't directly, but perhaps may indirectly be related to the Trent Horn video. I didn't watch the video. And that's the reason why I'm obviously not going to directly respond to it or respond to it at all intentionally, because I think obviously it would be quite stupid for me to respond to a video that I have not watched yet. But there have been a lot of questions about purgatory, about the nature of purgatory, about the nature of hell. So I just wanted to clear up a few things. If they're helpful and they're in line with what Trent said, awesome, great. If they happen to be discordant with what Trent says, then you can weigh everything that I say by its own merits and everything that he says by his own merits. But I know that I'm going to get asked about it, so it's something that I kind of want to get over with in the beginning. Okay. So when it comes to purgatory, I'm going to pull up a little Google Doc. I've done a few videos on this. This isn't one of my areas which I'm like super well read in. So I couldn't tell you about all of the different, schools, scholastic schools and their differences on this point, or I couldn't give you like super detailed descriptions about how everyone differs in debating on this point or anything like that. This isn't one of the areas, eschatology isn't one of those areas in which I've read a bunch about, okay? So just in the beginning, I'm just telling you what from St. Thomas Aquinas, Jugi, St. Robert Bellarmine, Suarez, authors like this, a little bit, I've read broadly, authors that represent different schools, and here I'm obviously just giving you what the common traditional view on this point is, and that's all I'm going to comment on it. I probably won't do any sort of like response or anything like that. It's just, I don't like being stuck in the constant cycle of response videos. I'd rather do other things, especially when it's an issue like this. Okay. So, when it comes to purgatory, we die in a certain state with, defects, right? And there's three sorts of defects. So first there is, the concupiscence of the flesh. So that's the first form of defect, right? Those are those habitual inclinations of the flesh where the flesh lusts against the spirit, right? That's what's going on with this first form of defect. And then you have the second form of defect. So this is some sort of how do I put it? Some sort of defect in the act of charity, right? So obviously we all have at the point of death, if we're in a state of grace, we have the habit of charity. We have not habitually turned away from God towards creatures, because if we have habitually turned away from God, that is called being in the state of mortal sin. We have made an act of mortal sin, and then there's a habitual state that we're in. But when it comes to venial sins and things of the like, there is a certain defect as to the act of charity, which is not exercised in its fullness. We can describe this as a lack of holiness, if you want to put it like that. And then this third aspect is going to be temporal debt of sin. So when it comes to temporal debt of sin, we have some way violated the order of justice, right? By mortal sins, which have been forgiven, we have two aspects to mortal sin, right? We turn away from God, and then we also turn towards creatures. Now, with charity, we turn back to God. So we've turned back to God, but we may have still those punishments due to the fact that we have turned towards creatures. We may actually have those habitual inclinations towards creatures that are an effect of mortal sin. And the venial sins, we don't turn away from God as our last end habitually, but we do somehow act and turn towards creatures. So in this way, we have certain temporal debt of sin. And temporal debt debt corresponds to punishment, right? And this has to do with the entire system of indulgences. For example, indulgences remit temporal punishment due to sin. This has to do with the entire system of penances that we do. So, a very large portion of Lent, for example, is chastising the flesh. It's voluntarily assuming certain punishments, right? So we die with these three forms going on right there. So we have to fix these three, right? So when it comes to the concupiscence of the concupiscence of the flesh is something that exists in the body, right? So since it's something that exists in the body, it's some sort of disorder of the lower appetites, what we call the material aspect of original sin, that unless we have a special privilege like that of the Blessed Virgin Mary on this side of eternity, we have not completely removed the concupiscence of the flesh. So when it comes to concupiscence of the flesh, this is actually not something which is healed in purgatory. Now, why is this the case? Or at least it's not formally healed in purgatory. Well, the reason this is the case is, as many of you can probably guess, in purgatory, we actually don't have a body. The resurrection of the body happens at the general judgment. So at the particular judgment, and then the state between the particular judgment and the general resurrection that happens at the end of days, we don't have a body. So the concupiscence of the flesh, this is something that is healed in the resurrection of the body. So you'll get a lot of statements from the fathers that are going to say that this disorder from Adam is not completely or perfectly healed until we have the resurrection of the body. This is what they're talking about right there. So now when it comes to the defect in the act of charity, there's some disagreement in this, okay? So the defect in the act of charity, some are going to say, following St. Thomas, St. Robert Bellarmine, and the common position of theologians, this isn't so universal to where someone would somehow be sinning against the faith if they disagreed with this, but it surely is a less common opinion, and I think it's an opinion that, on the basis of the theological sources and on the basis of due reason, is a position that can't be held. So some are going to say that this happens instantaneously. So because we're freed from the flesh, which the flesh the flesh which is infected with concupiscence is going to draw us away from our complete contemplation of God. And because we have some sort of uncertainty in the flesh, because we're able to commit mortal sin in the flesh, because of this, we're going to have a certain pulling back or a certain cooling of the act of charity. So what the Thomists and the majority of theologians are going to hold is that this defect in the act of charity is somehow going to be overcome in that first act of charity that we have in purgatory. So yes, there is a way in which we can talk about, and the Catechism talks about this, and a lot of the common liturgies of the Church, the fathers of the Church will sometimes use this language. Theologians will sometimes use this language. It's common in devotional texts. We'll talk about being sanctified in purgatory. So the sense in which we are sanctified in purgatory is this defect in the act of charity being overcome, right? We're not increasing in the habit of charity because this increase in the habit of charity would somehow increase our meriting. And we are not in a state of meriting after death. To say we're in a state of meriting after death, that's a condemned position. You can't hold to that. Cajetan tried to pull the fact that we merit in the first moment after death, and his position was universally rejected, and some theologians even gave it censures after he stated that opinion. So we are not in a state of meriting after death. So we don't habitually increase in charity. Rather, the act of charity brings about to its fullness in proportion to what has been brought about in us through the state of meriting in this life, right? So according to the majority of theologians, this happens instantaneously. Some others are going to say that actually the removal of the defects, which are due to venial sin, that this is something that happens over time. And then there's the third aspect of this. So the third aspect of this is going to be the temporal debt of sin. So the temporal debt of sin, this is we have violated the order of justice. And when we violate the order of justice, we somehow demerit. What does demerit mean? Well, demerit means that we earn some sort of punishment, right? So we've earned this punishment, and in order for the order of justice to be brought back in a fitting manner, there's two ways in which this could go about. So God could just completely wipe out and forgive the temporal debt due to sin, and this happens with in some cases. So, for example, you have somebody who, at the resurrection of the dead at the end of the world, they still have temporal debt. and God simply absolves them. So at the final judgment, God absolves many of the holy souls in purgatory from temporal debt due to sin. Others, we can think about the suffrages which are wrought for them in this life. So you should always remember the holy souls, have masses offered up for the holy souls, pray for the holy souls in purgatory. And these suffrages are somehow going to remove this temporal debt due to sin. And then also we can think about baptism. For example, baptism, because it's the sacrament of regeneration, baptism is going to completely remove the temporal debt due to sin, right? And then we could also ourselves suffer in this way. We can ourselves suffer in a process which is called satisfatio, so sort of redemptive suffering. We can voluntarily accept the punishments, the temporal punishments, which are due for our sins. Okay, so those are the three things which are taken away after death. So the reason, because there's going to be a question on the second point. So is it instant, which is the more common opinion? So more common opinion, St. Thomas, for example, holds to this, and the theologians following St. Thomas. So like Suarez, St. Robert, Bellarmine, etc. This is most of the tradition right here. Or does it take place over time? So there are a number of theologians who hold that it takes place over time, and a few modern theologians as well, right? So in taking place over time, so like a progressive sanctification of the soul rather than something instantaneous. The reason that I don't think this is something which is tenable is because of the fact, I guess I'll put it like this. I'll teach by way of example. So you have two souls. So one soul is, you have an old grandma. So this old grandma, let's say she's like in the illuminative way. She's, had a degree of further sanctification, the spiritual life. She somehow has gained a degree of holiness beyond what is most common, right? So you have this old grandma, let's say she dies suddenly, so she does not get the apostolic blessing at the end of her life, and she dies with temporal debt, but she's a degree holier than another individual. Let's say we have a second soul, and this second soul is one of the newly baptized. So the second soul, one of the newly baptized, also, right after their baptism, they get struck by lightning and dies. So the second soul right here, second soul does not spend any time in purgatory because temporal debt of sin right there is completely eradicated by the sacrament of baptism because it's the sacrament of regeneration of life from the dead, as I mentioned earlier. And then you have the old grandma right here. The old grandma, she's going to spend more time, and I can talk about the time issue a little bit later, but she's going to spend more time, or more instances, might be a better way of putting it, in purgatory than the newly baptized. And obviously the newly baptized is in a state of less sanctification than the old grandma. So I think our entire system of suffrages, indulgences, etc., doesn't make sense unless you are holding to an instantaneous view in the defect of charity, defect in the act of charity being overcome. So we talk about that. Second point is going to be the timing of purgatory. So there's something interesting here. There's a certain encyclical, and I think Trent probably mentioned this. Jimmy Akin often mentions it. It's Spe Salvi. So Spe Salvi, this is an encyclical by Benedict XVI. It is about eschatology, so it's about the final coming of Christ. It's about the last things. And he puts forward a certain view, but he doesn't put forward this certain view as himself teaching it, but he puts forward this view as an illustration. So this is what makes it so difficult. He says, well, some theologians say this about what purgatory is. And he's like, oh, this is such an interesting thought. We view it under this image, et cetera, et cetera. It's not like you would read, for example, Rerum Novarum, and you would see Leo XIII definitively teaching a sentence as Catholic teaching in an encyclical letter. A pope can, in certain teaching moments, he can say things as, okay, I'm definitively teaching this, I'm teaching this, I want you to hold this. So we have to give a level of assent, which is proportional to the teaching, which is given by the pontiff, the demand of assent, which is given by the teacher. But there's other things that popes can say in their teaching documents, which may be matter of illustration, of argument, etc. So in Spe Salvi, Benedict XVI, he puts forward some less than traditional, although traditional, I'm not saying as in they are somehow like contrary or somehow excluded necessarily as in Orthodox teaching by the history of the church, but it's somewhat of one of those instances of a recent theologian trying to come up with creative solutions or creative images, right? So he puts this forward as an image in Spe Salvi. And this is basically the fact that you have, an encounter with Christ is somehow going to basically be that purgatory which burns everything away. Now, when it comes to this, my conscience and none of your consciences are bound to what Benedict XVI says in Spe Salvi, because this isn't meant to somehow bind our consciences. As I mentioned, there's various different modes in which a pope can teach, but it does provide a little bit of awkwardness, because you do have a pope which is providing an illustration of some contemporary theological reflections that is not exactly what you find in the traditional images of the church, the traditional preaching of the church, etc. So when it comes to timing in purgatory, what the traditional teaching is going to be is that we have three different types of time. So we have time on earth. So time on earth is going to be that time of material substances. So time, you have to recognize that time is a measure of motion. So because time is a measure of motion, a measure of mobile bodies, it's going to be a measure of the change of these mobile bodies, of growth, generation, etc. So you have a lot of instances of beings, though, such as angels and the separated souls, which have not received their bodies back. These are not going to obviously have that material motion. Like angels don't have material motions. The souls in purgatory don't have material motions. The beatified souls don't have material motions. So when it comes to all of these, we can have like time on, time in heaven, purgatory, angels. So this is what we call the avum, or aviternity, is somehow as described. So when it comes to aviternity, this is going to be a motion which, if you know about numbers, rather than it being continuous, it's going to be something of discrete. So it's not continuous motion, it's discrete motion. So rather than going like, let's say I walk from here to here, that's continuous motion right there. That's continuous quantity right there. But if I have a jump from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and I don't take into consideration the length between those, that's discrete motion right there. So when it comes to angels, souls in purgatory, they experience time differently. They experience aviternity. They don't experience time like time on earth. So even speaking about the relationship between time on earth and time in purgatory is kind of weird. So even in the first place, we have a bit of difficulty, and we have to do a few anthropomorphisms when we speak of time in purgatory in the first place. And then I guess the last thing that I'm going to speak about this is what are the types of punishment, right? So I talked about timing. I talked about the objects which need to be removed. But what are the types of punishment? So traditionally, we distinguish between the pene sensus and the pene damni. The pene sensus and pene damni. So you probably heard me talk about this when it comes to the limbo. Limbo, I've probably spoken about this. But basically, the pene damni, this is separation from God. So there's a certain punishment for sin, which is separation from God. There's a certain separation from the beatific vision that happens on earth. There's a certain punishment, which is temporary separation, which happens in purgatory. There's certain punishment of eternal separation that happens in hell. And there's a corresponding dread that comes with this, right? So in a certain way, we can say, okay, hell is a separation from God, or purgatory is a temporary separation from God, or one of the punishments we have on this earth, we can talk about as a separation from God, right? And then there's a second aspect of punishment. So because we have not only turned away from our last end, But because we've used all of our faculties, both exterior faculties and interior faculties, because we have used these to sin against God, punishment, or this is normally used under the image of fire, it is universally taught that the punishment of hell is corporeal fire. Punishment of purgatory, there's disagreement over whether it's corporeal fire or not. But either way, there is a certain punishment of sense. There's a sensible affliction that happens on those in hell, and that also happens on those in purgatory. So those are the type of punishments, the pene sensus, pene domini. And if you want this like illustrated on this might jog your memory, the way in which this is normally talked about when it comes to limbo. There's the Augustinian position the Augustinian position of limbo, which holds that there is the first and second. So there's both the pain of sense and the pain of loss. So infants receive affliction in limbo, but this is the lightest of all afflictions. That's kind of how it gets described. And then you have the Lombardian or the Bellarmite position. And this is that you do not have the pain of sense, but you have the pain of loss with affliction. So the infants have some sort of interior affliction from the fact that they are in limbo. And then you have the Thomist position. And the Thomist position is that you have the pain of loss, so therefore they can properly be said to be damned. But they do not have any affliction because the affliction from the pain of loss happens because one was in a state in which they were provided with those actual graces, which they could have cooperated with and remotely prepared themselves for justification. That's all that I'll say. I know this went on for 20 minutes, which was a little bit longer than I wanted it to, but that's in a nutshell the whole purgatory hell question. I don't know how much Trent disagrees with what I says or agrees with what I said, but since so many of you are going to ask about a general overview of purgatory hell, I thought that I would provide it in a bit of a non-confrontational manner, not directly responding to what Trent said.